All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Yeah, sorry, I'm been pretty inconsistent with my time of release of these videos. I've got some family stuff going on, and so there's just I just have to do it whenever I can do it. And but in general, on this channel, we check out great theories and concepts and discoveries that you probably haven't heard of because they've been suppressed. Somebody has a vested interest in not wanting you to know this material. And we are doing, I believe this is our 284th Bible Decode. And so obviously we're not talking about the Bible as far as the suppressed material, but in really more of its interpretation. Many different authors have proffered books about the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. And that is that the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, from 69 until 96 AD, they are the true authors of the New Testament according to this theory. And that's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the New Testament. They backdated the story by 40 years and put it in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, which that's where it starts. I mean, the adult Jesus part, and that's in 28 or 29 AD. And but it was written much later, and they wrote this story of the Gospels, and they also wrote the history of a book called War of the Jews, which is a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews. And in this war, the two main military commanders for the Romans were General Vespasian and his son General Titus, before they became emperors. And they were both wounded in this war. They both witnessed the incredible aggressiveness and militancy of the Jews and their willingness to die for their beliefs, which really went back to 63 BC when the Romans pulled into Judea. They had been giving the Romans problems the whole time. And so the Caesars, even though they utterly destroyed the Jews in this war, they recognized that the Jews would be back at some point. And so, you know, they took advantage of the fact that they knew that the Jews were literally waiting for a Messiah from their, sacred books, the books of the Old Testament, that the books that became the Old Testament. And the Jews were waiting for a military Messiah to help them overthrow the Romans, in this case, overthrow whatever colonial power. And instead, the Romans wrote Gospels of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, meaning paying your taxes, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack, as it was the law that Jews, when they saw a Roman soldier, they were supposed to have to carry their pack for a mile. Jesus advocates going the extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack. And Jesus believes in turning the other cheek to oppression. In other words, Jesus is totally deferential to the Romans. There's really nothing in the four Gospels that indicates any type of pushback against the Romans. But there is a lot of pushback against the Jews, such as overturning the tables outside the temple, outside the inner court of the temple, and cussing out the Jews who were selling animals for the sacrifice at the same temple, advising his Jewish disciples to abandon their families to follow him, and so on. Basically, just as if it would have been had it been written by the Romans. And then as we proceed in the New Testament, we see that Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and even more negative toward the Jews, especially the Jewish rituals and traditions that had given the Romans so much difficulty, such as the circumcision and the kosher food laws and the animal sacrifices, the Passover ritual. These are things, the observance of the Sabbath. These are things that the Romans, it was just high maintenance for them to, kind of maintain that, to allow the Jews to maintain that. And so they wanted to rub it out, and the Gospels were their method for doing that. Now, it's more than just this type of psychological operation for purely political purposes as well. There was plenty of mean-spirited mockery involved as well, and humor. When you read The War of the Jews by Josephus, the author's name is Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars by adoption. And that work is in 7 volumes, but if you read it, you will see a myriad of parallels with the New Testament. And many of those parallels contain messages or, codes, or, you can glean the intentions, and they are always in the direction of mockery and demeaning and, derision. Oftentimes, it becomes bawdy and pornographic. The Romans loved this kind of stuff. They loved wordplay and enigmas and codes and ciphers and aliases and fake names and nicknames and pseudonyms. And they loved juggling around the languages. They were pretty much bilingual in both Latin and Greek, and so sometimes they would take a word in Latin and change it into Greek before permutating it a little bit. And so some of these Romans may have had dozens of different pseudonyms or different names, but it's all really talking about the same people. And it takes a real amount of detective work to kind of uncover that. A lot of that was done by Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso in the late 70s and the 1980s. They independently determined that the author of the New Testament was Josephus. And so that's the same thing that I'm saying, although I don't really believe that Josephus ever existed. He's just a pseudonym for some other Roman royal. Because if you read Josephus's autobiography, it's not believable whatsoever. And so, this is another thing about the Roman origins hypothesis, is that it is devastating. It doesn't just take down the New Testament of the Bible and therefore, render Christianity as being fictitious. It also takes down Satan as well. Satan is also a construct of the Romans. There's no such thing in the Old Testament. Satan is mentioned a handful of times, but every time it's referring to an actual human. And then there's a lot of these other cults, other gods in the Old Testament that you might think of as Satan, like Baal or Moloch. But these are really competing gods, gods who are competing against Yahweh. They're all gods with a small g. And they're all competing against each other. That's what Baal was like. I can't remember. It was if he was Syrian or I can't remember which one of these Middle Eastern tribes that he was kind of worshipped by. But they were just local gods of other tribes. And in fact, in the Old Testament, many of the Hebrews and the Israelites, they worshiped these other gods too. There's Ashtoreth, which is Ishtar in Babylonian, and Inanna in Sumerian, and then there is Baal and Shamash, and these are not Satan. These are just competing gods to Yahweh, and so the Satan in the Old Testament is not what it is today. That's from the New Testament, and then also amplified by people like Milton in Paradise Lost and Dante's Divine Comedy, and the Inferno, but mainly by Hollywood in the 20th century. If you think of your mental image of Satan, it's probably from some Hollywood movie or cartoon or something like that. So that is thrown out the window as well by the Roman origins hypothesis. It also throws out Josephus, who is kind of like the main historian that historians now lean upon for our understanding of the first century. I believe that Josephus I don't know if it's War of the Jews or if it is his Jewish Antiquities, but I believe Josephus is like the author of the second biggest selling book of all time behind the Bible. So this is just a huge, and so if Josephus and the New Testament are paralleling each other, if they're parodying each other back and forth, that means that neither one of them is, they're both fictitious. They're both written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And so that eliminates Josephus. Then it also eliminates a lot of these authors, literary figures, who were writing in code about Jesus being a Roman construction, particularly Shakespeare, who is pretty much recognized as the greatest author in Western canon, and all of her books are about the Roman origins hypothesis and really fighting back against the Roman origins hypothesis. And so I don't know if that makes the Shakespearean corpus any less artistic or whatever, but it kind of has to be seen in a different light. I was thinking about that in terms of like all of this gambling in sports, and so you're thinking all of these sports are totally rigged, like and people are like, well, if these sports are totally rigged, why do you watch them? And it's like, well, if they're rigged, that means that they're acting. And so it only takes it down to the level of a movie or a soap opera or something like that, where they're acting too. You just know they're acting. But I think it actually amplifies it, because if they're really acting, they're really damn good at it. And like, it not only in terms of the athletic ability to pull off exactly what you're trying to pull off. I mean, I can see how a football game would be rigged just to get the right score, but some people think that it's rigged to the point of, like, how many yards you gain on a certain play or whatever, on every play. Every play is scripted. And if they're doing that, they're really good at it. So it's worth watching it just for the show. But also in terms of the emotion, they're always expressing this emotion at exactly the right time. So they're pretty good at cheating, or at being rigged, if it's that big of a conspiracy. And the same is true for the New Testament. If the whole thing is a fictional tale and it's a psychological operation, it's pretty well done. It's pretty. You have to tip your cap to the evil geniuses that were involved in putting this together. But what it really is, though, is more like a limited hangout. They put a lot of pretty good stuff in the New Testament. They had to, in order for people to believe it at all. You have to give them something that they can hang their hat on in terms of, a moral code and ethics, and, the understanding of the divine and so on. So, it's just kind of like the internet or something like that. Internet being a, construction of the military, and to a certain extent the intelligence agencies, and it's supposed to be like a tool for evil, but you can turn it into a tool of good as well. And the same could be true for the New Testament. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I think it's more in terms of Christians being able to absolutely cherry pick the small amount of good stuff that's in there and kind of leave the rest of it behind. And so, most Christians, they can quote you a few hundred verses from the New Testament that are, valid for all kinds of different circumstances. And then they just kind of ignore the rest of it. And then they conveniently ignore some other things that they really intuited that that's not right, and we have to do it this way, regardless of what it says. And it was like, so all the stuff Jesus says about family, about you have to abandon your families, and you have to hate. In Luke 14:26, he talks about hating your family to become his disciple. And so Christians got rid of that, and they say that Jesus is a big family guy, and rightly so. They need to say that, even though it's not true, because if you have an ethic of hating your family, you're not going to get very far. You're going to get as far as having 12 disciples and being set off from the rest of the world or whatever. Anyway. We're going to do a short reading today, and this really more has to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, another suppressed thing that was discovered in the 1940s and 50s, but was withheld from public consumption by a bunch of Dominican priests who were tasked with translating and disseminating the work, but then they found something they didn't like, and so they just sat on the stuff for 40 years. Priceless documents that were older than any Old Testament documents that had ever been discovered, plus a lot of very explosive sectarian material from the monks that lived at Qumran, which is where these were discovered. And so we're reading from Robert Eisenman's book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. He's one of the people that actually liberated the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1980s, late 1980s. And he's talking here, we're about to start chapter 8, about paleographic problems, paleographic problems. This is a understanding of dating, like dating documents based on the penmanship. Like, so there are kind of different styles of penmanship that evolved gradually over time. And when you kind of look at the way that the documents are written, you can kind of determine what time, what time period they were written. Unfortunately, I believe that it's a valid thing to do, but it's just not that accurate. You're not going to be able to pin anything down within, a single year or something like that, but not even close. I'd say that the best you could get would be maybe of the right century. Maybe a little bit less than that. But so the Dominican priests used this science in order to date the Dead Sea Scrolls back to the 2nd century BC. Robert Eisenman, they're like basically pushing it as far as they can away from Jesus, away from the story in the New Testament. Eisenman believes that these scrolls were actually written in the 1st century AD, right at the same time that Jesus was said to have lived and died. Mainly, maybe kind of like the period right after he died. So he's talking about that in this chapter. It's called Paleographic Problems. The above reconstruction, I submit, is as good as any constructed around Essenes, as such, or so-called zealots, and unlike any of these, has the virtue of being able to give a plausible explanation to the whole expanse of Zadokite literature from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. In addition, it does not resort to unknown or hypothetical individuals and or teachers to do it. So he's talking about his reconstruction that came from earlier passages in the same book that are really trying to figure out this stuff based on the texts, the words of the texts themselves, not the kind of meta stuff like the penmanship and the archaeology that goes behind it. That stuff works, but I think it needs to be overruled by the actual text. I mean, if the text says that it's from this time period, but the paleography or whatever says that it's from 2 centuries earlier, which are you going to believe? That's a good question. I mean, it could be that they're lying. I mean, you can't trust what it says 100%. When there is a conflict, it raises a question, then you have to, kind of figure it out. I would give more weight to the actual text, but you can't trust that, just because it says what it is. There's all this stuff, all of it is censored by the Romans. I mean, the Romans, if it doesn't agree with what the Romans want in the Roman Empire, then it's not going to be published and it's not going to be disseminated. So, it is important to recognize that all of this stuff, every one of these documents, whether it's in the canon or in the Apocrypha or what it is, it's all propaganda. It's all, got an agenda. Okay, everyone mentioned is known. As tempting as escapism might be, we have enough historical evidence from different sources in this period, even if some are patently folkloric or mythological, to demand that scholars toe the line on making historical identifications. It is also in keeping with paleographical finds, such as they are, as it is with archaeological, historical, and literary critical evidence. For instance, it very easily explains the archaizing Maccabean script so prominent among the scripts at Qumran. difficult to explain for those who see the group as being anti-Maccabean. What is more, it does not resort to thinking that first century AD peshers of biblical material give intimate explanations of events that occurred in the 2nd century BC. This is absurd. This is as absurd as thinking that nowadays a preacher would interpret biblical scripture in terms of the events surrounding the lives of George Washington, Napoleon, or the Duke of Wellington. Indeed, this is the time span involved, since the exegetical texts known as peshers are all from the 1st century AD. And so pesher is just like a Jewish thing where they interpret a scripture kind of in a subtextual way by using all the allusions with an A, all of the allusions that they make to other texts that you also know about. And so it's kind of a secret language, like if you don't know the allusion, then you miss the subtextual. And so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a number of peshers. One is the Habakkuk, and another one is it's another one of the minor prophets. But yeah, so there's a few of these peshers that are also part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So found only in single copies, these are not the classical, but rather represent the current literature of the sect, which is why the Habakkuk pesher is found so neatly deposited in Cave 1 is so important. To think they relate to events in the Maccabean period or those covered by Daniel, except where this is expressly so stated for internal historiographical demands of the text itself, as already noted, is unrealistic. I would have to agree. These texts were very likely the quickly written records of weekly Sabbath scripture sessions held by the teacher of righteousness. The Dead Sea Scrolls has really 3 main characters: the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. And the contest is like figure out who is who, especially if you're trying to attach these to the gospel stories. Is the teacher of righteousness Jesus? Eisenman thinks it's James, the brother of Jesus. Some people think it's John the Baptist. The liar, some people think that's Jesus, and some people think it's Paul. So that makes it kind of interesting to try to figure that out. They were likely quickly written records of weekly Sabbath scripture sessions held by the teacher, whoever the current office holder might have been, in his role as unique interpreter of the Bible. It is inconceivable that the community as a whole had nothing new to say or no reactions while 150 years of the most vital and controversial history in Palestine passed before its eyes. That, on the contrary, it sat passively and piously by studying or penning texts relating to the period leading up to 63 BC or before. It should be properly understood that this is what would be involved in following the generally accepted theories, and yet acknowledging that the documents were deposited in caves in 68 AD or thereafter, to which there are no serious objections. And that corresponds with the war. And so the Romans invaded Qumran, this monastery, and that right before that happened is when they started putting all these in these special vases or jars and stashing them in these caves. it should, or perhaps the Romans did it. You know, the Romans might have stashed all those. My current theory is that the Romans had a psychological operation contest. Who can write the best gospel? Who can write the best epistles? And so they had like hundreds of them. And then they took the ones they liked the best and they put all the rest of them in these caves. Except that doesn't really work because the documents that are in the caves are generally written in Hebrew, whereas, you know, the Bible and the Romans wrote in Greek. And Josephus is also in Greek. It should also be stated categorically that 68 AD is the terminus aquo for the deposit of the scrolls in the caves, not the terminus ad quem for the cessation of habitation in the region of Qumran, which it is generally taken to be. So he's saying that they still lived, they continued to live there after 68 AD. That I don't see, but he'll probably explain it, and we'll get into that tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. And please come back tomorrow. We'll learn more about these Dead Sea Scrolls, and what happened to them, and what they can teach us, and what's been suppressed. All right, have a great evening.